Hello all. So I want to take a break from the BDNF and the HPA axis, as lovely as it is, and talk about relationships, specifically closure in relationships. So I happened to come across a video recently put up on another channel by Matthew Hussey. And in this video, he talks about closure and how this is often a focal point that's hyper-focused on by many of us post-apocalyptic breakup from some significant other. Or maybe it's just you're on the dating scene, you thought you were interested in this person and they ghosted you, or they stopped showing interest, or they fell off the radar, etc. Right? And he talks about how we can sometimes get wrapped up in this idea of I need closure before I move on. I want to weigh in on this idea. So first of all, I want to qualify what I think he's saying and speak to that. So he makes the equation that disinterest on the part of some significant other or potential significant other is essentially closure in and of itself. And where I think he's going with this is that we can get tied up in the process of being, overly invested in hoping that this person will come around. We can spend all this emotional energy in the process of pining for this person after they've moved on or they've broken up with us, and we continue to focus on that. And I think what he's saying is he's advocating for this idea that doesn't lead to the growth and self-growth, and you're going to miss opportunities. You're not going to be open to meeting other people because you're in this state of pining over this person, etc. Which fully agree with that point. That we can get caught up in that, and it's helpful to have a way of framing that for ourselves. What I want to specify about this, that disinterest is closures. I want to leave it in one category, and I want to say disinterest is intellectual closure. However, it's often the case that disinterest is not emotional closure for a person. What do I mean by that? Well, in this process of separating from someone, of the breakup, I think part of where Hussey's going is this idea of don't still be tied, webbed into what this person is doing. You have to move on in your own self. You have to separate and emotionally separate and move on. And I agree with that. But one of the things that can happen, one of the risks of this idea of closure in the form of disinterest is that you can take your intellect, and I'm calling that intellectual closure, you can take that and you can use it actually to suppress the emotional kind of closure you might need. And so it's possible that you can cause harm, that you can actually create problems down the road for yourself in not allowing the space for the things that might come up around the breakup of this relationship. For example, it's often the case that in what I do in my practice of medicine, I end up treating people who are coming out of relationships. That's a big stressor for most people. And so we can get stuck in the process. But one thing that I see quite often is that the suppression of what you're feeling, even if it's by something good like the intellect and thinking, I need to make sure that I label this as, in a certain way, such that I realize that I'm not still emotionally tied to this person, or I'm not still I'm not still investing or enabling myself to still kind of be attached to them, even though they've moved on. Right? I think that's the caution, that's the concern Hussey has, is that you're not open to other people because you're still tied to this previous relationship. And I fully agree with that. The question or the problem becomes when we end up using that I need to make sure that I move on and don't allow the space for the processing to understand what happened and for self-growth. And so what can happen is then we go into the next relationship and we create all over again the same thing, and we haven't learned the lesson of here's emotionally what came up for me. So I'm going to give you an exercise that can actually help with the emotional, heart-centered processing and closure of a piece, particularly when you're estranged from the person, when you can't talk to them because they've either cut you off or possibly they've flown the country or they've died, right? Death is another way that, you have things you wanted to say to someone and now they're gone and you can't say them. And so what I'm going to give you is this tool that you can use in order to emotionally get at those components and have emotional closure. So the exercise is this. You're going to write 3 letters. You're not going to mail these letters, but you're going to write 3 letters, and you're going to pick a situation where you need closure with some other person, whether they be dead, whether it be an ex-boyfriend, whether it be some scenario where you cannot or you feel like you can't gain closure. You're going to write from a heart-centered emotional space. Keep that in mind all the way through this exercise. The first letter you're going to write to this person, and you're going to basically describe the grievances that you have from an emotional place, the stuff that you feel is unresolved. I feel sad that you left me. I feel hurt that we're not together anymore. Whatever it is, you fully indulge it, dump it onto the page, get it out. That's letter number 1. And again, I would encourage you to try to not go into the analyzing and the intellectual space where you're thinking about, trying to ask why, because ultimately that's part of the problem, is this trying to understand the why in their behavior. When you cannot get answers to that, and it is kind of futile. And I think more or less that's what Hussey talks about. It's like, no, you're not going to know why, and you don't need to know why, ultimately. If you get that down the road, great. Maybe that's helpful. But ultimately, you need to solve this in yourself. So you write this letter, the first letter, and you're basically bearing your soul of the emotional content of what it is that you feel is unresolved. That's letter number 1. Letter number 2, you're going to write back to yourself from this other person, from their perspective, in quotes, with the following specification. You're not going to write the letter that you think they would write. You're not going to write the letter that, if so-and-so were to be writing this letter back to me, what would they say? Again, that's inviting the very thing that Hussey's talking about, this why. Instead, you want to write what you need. So you're going to write what it is that you feel from that emotional content in the first letter that you wrote that you need to most hear from this person. So whether it be, I'm so sorry, Jen, I can't believe I did that to you, and I hurt, and I'm sorry. That could be the letter that you need to hear. Whatever that letter is, you write it. And again, it doesn't matter. Don't get into the theoretical of would this happen if this person were to write this letter. That's not the point. The point is for the emotional closure piece. So write it back to yourself and indulge your heart. Tell your heart give your heart the pieces that it needs to hear. Maybe it's that this person really did love you and now they're moving on. I mean, whatever it is that you need for closure, that's what you put into this second letter. The third letter is the letter that if after receiving that second letter, whatever you need to say to finally close up the deal. So maybe in response to that letter where they said they were sorry, you need to say thank you. Thank you for finally telling me that, because I needed to hear that. You close up the loose ends, and what I think you will find is how much this can help you process and move towards the emotional kind of closure, in addition to the intellectual closure that Hussey offers, in terms of labeling it as, closure based on disinterest. Well, the emotional piece you can deal with in the way that I've just described, I should say. I am a prescriber, and I'm prescribing letters right now, so very interesting there. If you happen to do this, and which I encourage you to, share in the comments what your experience is. You don't have to share the letters that you write, obviously, but share what your experience is. What I think you will find is that it gives you amazing insight into this maybe stuff that keeps turning up for you from relationship to relationship. Also, you will be shocked at how healing this exercise can be, how much you get to process, basically, this underlying, the content that's around it. And maybe it's not about the person. In fact, I can almost guarantee that it's not about the person that you broke up from. It's about you. And that's the point. So you're completing the circle in yourself. It's not dependent on something else this other person is doing, or that you're expecting from them, or where you think, I just need that email from them, or I need them to call me again, whatever, where you're hung up on that. This is about you and you processing and being a complete and whole person after this relationship, so you're ready for the next relationship. And that, my friend, is how you get closure.